This evening, Brother Aaron Raverty is giving the presentation. Brother Aaron has been a monk of this monastery since 1972. He came here after completing a degree in anthropology at the University of Minnesota. After making vows in 72, actually 73 I think, huh? 74. Really? Okay. First vows in 74? Okay. Oh my God, I tell you. Okay. Earth to John, okay? After making vows, huh? Let me back up. After making vows, he had a complicated, which is not uncommon, a complicated mixture of formation, studying theology towards a master's degree here at the SOT, teaching both anthropology and sociology at the prep school, as well as then followed by anthropology in the university. And when he had done all that, he went to the University of Minnesota and earned a doctorate in anthropology there. He taught in the university until 1990, when he took a position at the Liturgical Press, where he served as an editor. His specialty was big books, such as dictionaries published under the Michael Glaser imprint. Aaron has long been interested in interreligious dialogue. He traveled to East Asia, that is to Tibet, to Nepal, and northern India as part of the pilgrimage devoted to interreligious dialogue in 1995, and he participated in the first Gethsemane encounter. His doctoral research focused on interreligious dialogue at the intentional community at Crestone, which he then revisited last spring and summer for further investigation. Aaron also served on the board of the monastic interreligious dialogue from 1994 to 1999. He is also an expert in handwriting analysis, a fine vocalist, and he also likes to watch birds. Okay? His topic for tonight is Anthropology meets Theology. And this is a lot of C words here. The creative Crestone collision conversation. Please give a warm welcome to Brother Aaron.
Thank you very much, John. In my presentation tonight, I will address three topics. First of all, some reflections on the inner hermit experience within Benedict and monasticism based on my sabbatical stay at the Hermitage of the Spiritual Life Institute near Crestone, Colorado. Two, a summary of my ethnographic fieldwork involving the many religious and spiritual organizations and networks in the region. And three, some suggestions for enhancing interreligious dialogue through the application of anthropological research methods based on my fieldwork encounters. The first topic is I want to talk a little bit about the inner hermit and Benedictine monasticism. Now, St. Benedict had nothing against hermits. As the oft-proclaimed father of Western monasticism, he reserved his highest praise for the Cenobites, those monks who lived in community under a rule and an abbot. But he began his own ministry as a hermit monk, only later collecting a following of converts. Listen to what Benedict says in his rule in chapter 1, the kinds of monks, and I quote here from R.B. 1980. There are the anchorites or hermits who have come through the test of living in a monastery for a long time and have passed beyond the first fervor of the monastic life. Thanks to the help and the guidance of many, they are now trained to fight against the devil. They have built up their strength and go from the battle line and the ranks of their brothers to the single combat of the desert. Self-reliant now, and without the support of another, they are ready with God's help to grapple single-handed with the vices of body and mind. My stay at the Spiritual Life Institute, the Nada Hermitages, right on the outskirts of Crestone, Colorado, from May through October 2001 was quite an experience. This is a Carmelite community that has about 50 acres of land and about 17 individual hermitages that are spread over the land. And people regularly come to stay at these hermitages for a hermit or anchoritic experience. I'd like to just comment a little bit on some of my own personal kinds of reflections on being a hermit, coming from a communal monastic life and being a hermit for about 6 months here in the Nada Hermitages. First of all, one of the things I experienced is that it kind of increased my tendency toward what I call anthropomorphism and animism, anthropopsychism. Some anthropologists have said that the primordial human religious impulse is derived from animism and anthropomorphism. That is, human beings seem to be hard-wired to perceive spirit beings, which is animism, and in human form, anthropomorphism in the environment. The founder of anthropology, one of the founders, Sir Edward Tyler, back in the 1870s, says that animism was probably the earliest form of religion, the belief in spirit beings. One of the reasons I kind of connected with anthropomorphism and animism is that I had so many visitors around my little hermitage that come from the animal world. Golly, I had coyotes, I had mule deer, I had vultures, I had eagles, I had owls. They'd regularly come right up to the hermitage. I had these wonderful picture windows, and I could almost commune with these animals because they'd come right up there and they kind of try to look in at me. And sometimes being a hermit and getting kind of lonely in experience, I was kind of tempted to want to communicate with them. And I almost kind of envisioned myself in some sense making a connection with some of these animals. The third term that you see on the list here isn't one that's really too common, anthropopsychism. It's kind of a big word and it's not used too often, but it refers to our tendency to read into other animals human feelings, human thoughts. I think we do this with pets a lot. We say that pets are hungry, or they're sad, or they want to go outside, or they want to do something. How do we know what the cognitive state of these animals really are? But we tend to read into animals our own human emotions and thoughts. So this is one thing I kind of experienced on this kind of animistic, anthropomorphic, anthropopsychic connection. Here was the name of my little hermitage, the Benedict Hermitage. They have names for all these hermitages, like Augustine and Benedict, and I think it was Pius the 10th was another one. So I was in the Benedict Hermitage, which I thought was very appropriate. Also, my hermit experience really helped me to become more sensitively attuned to kind of nuances of sensory experience. I noticed that when I was there for a while, things like colors, textures, sights, sounds, when you're not constantly bombarded or with human interaction and human relationship, you tend to become much more attuned to your sensory experience. And I thought that was also a real plus. Here's a little photo of my hermitage, a very comfortable little hermitage. way out in the middle of this semi-desert area, about 8,000 feet elevation, and very, very different from Minnesota, very different environment. One of the other things that I noticed being a hermit for a time in this place was that I was more attuned to issues of sustainability. I had to do my own cooking, for example, and it was very difficult to when you're doing your own cooking, you have to be very careful about what you're buying, how you're wasting stuff, how you're able to recycle things. The hermitages there were very careful too about recycling, and so it was a very. I became much more aware of issues of sustainability. Something else that affected me as a hermit monk was a kind of a support of an emotional catharsis and a healing of memories. When you're alone and you have to kind of develop your own structure of life and your own prayer life, and you're not talking with people a great deal, you know that we all have some baggage from the past, some emotional issues that tend to arise. Well, this was a wonderful occasion for me to kind of a self-cleansing experience with the healing of memories and emotional catharsis. One of the other things I experienced as a hermit monk too was when I first got to Crestone, I was very, very concerned about getting my own structure of my life together. When you're in a Benedictine community, life is very, very structured. We have meals, prayers, everything happens right at a particular time, and you come to rely on that particular structure. But when you're alone, you have to devise a structure all for yourself. And at first, this was a very daunting experience. But I finally began to say to myself, "Oh, Aaron, why don't you let go and let God?" And I gradually began to fall into kind of a pattern of life where I was, felt very comfortable without feeling I had to kind of over-structure myself in lots of ways. This is a little road that leads up to the chapel. Part of the complex that I stayed in, the Spiritual Life Institute, had a building called the Agape building, which had a wonderful library and a kitchen area and some administrative centers. Here's a photo of it from outside, and you can see the chapel is the higher part there where the cross is, and it was a wonderful, compact little building, and it's a wonderful place. If any of you would ever like to have a hermit experience, I would highly recommend it. I think it's a terrific place. Here was one of the mountains that when I would walk outside of my hermitage, this is Challenger Peak. It's about 14,000 feet, and it greeted me every day. And it was a wonderful thing to open your door to in the morning and to be able to see the beauty of this particular area. Here's another view that gives you some feel for the environment. Very, very dry conditions there, lots of sage, lots of juniper. If you look closely, I think you can almost detect a little bit of a rainbow. They had some beautiful rainbows there, and I tried to capture them, but my little digital camera was really not that good. But it gives you a sort of feel for the environment there and the natural beauty that surrounded you all the time. So it was a wonderful place from that point of view. I'm going to switch gears here, and I'm going to talk now a little bit about a summary of some of my ethnographic fieldwork. But before I really do that, I'd like to ask a question of those of you who are here. How many of you have ever had a course in anthropology, or maybe are taking one right now? Could you just raise your hands? Okay, so a few of you have, and for those of you who have had a course, this will be kind of a review, and for those of you who have not, this will be a very brief introduction to anthropology. Now, sometimes when we hear the word anthropology, we think of, a philosophical anthropology or a theological anthropology. That word is used in different contexts. But the anthropology I'm talking about here is the social and behavioral science of anthropology that had its origins probably in about the 1870s. One anthropologist has described the field as the exploration of human diversity. And I think that's a very succinct but very pointed definition of anthropology, the exploration of human diversity. There's another anthropologist who described it as anthropology is the most scientific of the humanities and the most humanistic of the sciences. So that's another little twisty phrase that you can use. It's a very complex field. There's at least 4 major subdivisions to the field of anthropology, and some would say now there are 5. Physical or biological anthropology studies such things as human evolution, comparative primatology. After all, humans are primates biologically. Population genetics and human physical variation, what we normally call race or racial characteristics. Archaeology is a reconstruction of past human behavior from material remains. Linguistic anthropology studies human language variation and the relationships of language to other aspects of culture. And finally, sociocultural anthropology, which is the area that I have specialized in, studies human symbolic behavior and the patterns that humans form to give them kind of a lifestyle and a worldview that they transmit from one generation to another. And some would say nowadays that there's even a 5th subdivision of anthropology called practicing or engaged or applied anthropology, where anthropologists don't just do studies of these things in an academic way, but they act as kind of cultural brokers. They actually go into communities where they help the people because of their expert knowledge of how human societies are put together and some of the economic and the ecological and the political issues. They will actually act as kind of agents of culture change. So my particular area here that I specialized in is the anthropology of religion, and more to the point, I'm going to talk a little bit about ethnography. So what in the world is ethnography? Ethnography is a detailed, descriptive account of a society's customary behavior, beliefs, and attitudes that's based on fieldwork. And I think there's 2 key terms here when we're talking about ethnography. We're talking about holism and integration. Holism and integration are 2 important goals of the anthropological enterprise. The ethnographer is charged with explaining what holds together, what integrates the community he or she is researching as a single operating kind of unit, or and that's holism. The goal of fieldwork is to recognize patterns, and the goal of writing ethnography is to express them. Okay, what are some of the methods? I spoke earlier that I was trying to connect some of the methods that cultural anthropologists use, and I'm going to relate that now to interreligious dialogue. But what are some of the qualitative ethnographic methods that anthropologists use? These, I think, are some of the main ones, and you will be spared because I'm not going to describe every one of these to you here. It's just way too much detail, and it's kind of a little teaser because I'm writing a book right now, and I do look at these in a great deal of detail in the book that I'm writing. But this gives you some idea of the range of methods that cultural anthropologists use to study a particular group. Let me give you a little bit of the background about this project. I first heard of Crestone, Colorado in 1980. My originally planned overseas dissertation research site had become a dangerous place for American citizens, and I was on the lookout for another less risky venue. I got word that St. John's Abbey had been invited to establish a retreat center in the San Luis Valley of south central Colorado. Because of a lack of adequate staff and resource requirements at that time, St. John's had to decline the offer. But I began to wonder whether Crestone might be an alternative place to do my research, especially when I heard that a number of spiritual communities were beginning to take up residence there. After a brief on-site visit and a meeting with sponsors Hannah and Marie Strong, who were the two that owned this area of land, I decided to do my research in this promising area developing around Crestone with the blessing and permission of our late Abbot Jerome Tyson and the Strongs. Now, Crestone has a very colorful history as an old mining and ranching town that witnessed periods of prosperity and decline through the later 19th and early 20th centuries. It had almost become a ghost town by the latter decades of the last century. In my investigations of this area in the early 1980s, I was there in 81 and 82, Maurice and Hannah Strong were inviting a great variety of groups, many of them non-Christian and culturally foreign, to come to the valley and settle in. The Strongs supported this process by donations of land in exchange for the group's establishment of a spiritual center of some kind in the Crestone area, for example, a temple or a retreat center, and to staff it year-round. On the other hand, there were a number of local residents who lived in the smaller towns and immediate areas just outside of the land grant, where this land was, who were very poor and had limited education. Many of these locals identified themselves as born-again Christians who espoused a very exclusivist religious perspective and who looked askance at all these foreign and pagan religious and cultural traditions that the Strongs were inviting to come and to settle there. In line with a prophetic call, Hannah and Maurice hoped to stimulate the establishment of what they call a refuge for world truths alongside an area of real estate development. For their roles in facilitating this vision, I describe Hannah and Maurice as ideological entrepreneurs, designation I elaborate in my original dissertation. Since at that time the various religious organizations had not yet established themselves as they have today, Hannah, who was regularly on site at this time, became the agent who promoted and made arrangements for public teachings, performances, and ritual displays when these diverse groups were invited to visit the area in anticipation of possibly settling there. The local born-again folks told me that eventually this valley was going to undergo an Armageddon in which the forces of Christ were going to do battle with the forces of the Antichrist that Hannah and Maurice were inviting into the valley, and that the Christian forces in the end would prevail. As we fast forward to the 1990s, we note the establishment of the Manitou Foundation, which continues the work of providing land and wilderness refuge areas around the Crestone environs. Today, approximately 22 religious and spiritual organizations and networks have taken up residence here, and they attract visitors from near and far away. For my recent sabbatical project, I chose to return to Crestone to research how the methods used by cultural anthropologists might play a role in enhancing the practice of interreligious dialogue. Now, what are some of these organizations that are on site outside of Crestone right now? Well, this gives you a kind of a list, and I apologize for the small size. I hope you can read these, but I wanted to get them all on the same screen. But you can see that there are quite a diversity of organizations and centers that are there right now. There are 4 or 5 Tibetan Buddhist temples and retreat centers. There are 2 Sufi networks. There are 2 Zen Buddhist temples. There are a couple New Age groups that are there as well. There is the Crestone Carmelite Spiritual Life Institute, where I stayed, is one of them. There's also an Episcopal church right in Crestone. But you can see there are 2 the Hindu ashrams as well. You can see there's quite a variety of groups now that have come to settle in this area. Here's a slide. They had a conference when I was there, and here's a photo of the leaders, the directors of these various spiritual organizations that are there, to give you some idea of what they look like. Okay, because I'm not going to, I don't have time to talk about all the details of my project, I've given you a little ethnographic summary here. The religious and spiritual community, taken as a whole, that's adjacent to the town of Crestone, Colorado, originally envisioned and then created through the agency of ideological entrepreneurs, now stands as a refuge for world truths, a living spiritual museum and marketplace, a pilgrimage destination operating according to the principles of a ritual economy. Now, I've already introduced you to the term ideological entrepreneurs. I said that Hannah and Marie Strong were the 2 that were inviting these various groups to come and to settle there. But my ethnographic investigation into the religious and spiritual organizations and networks near Crestone has led me to lay claim to the intersection of 2 theoretical frameworks. That is, the ritual structure of pilgrimage and the operation of what I call a ritual economy. And again, I don't have a lot of time to talk about these right now, but these are little teasers that you can use to read my book when it comes out. And I do deal with these 2 frameworks in quite a bit of detail. Okay. The initiative for this project is interdisciplinary. As a professional sociocultural anthropologist with graduate level training in systematic theology, I am equipped for a special way of framing the contributions that one discipline can make to another. My concentration in anthropology, namely the anthropology of religion, and my special interests in theological anthropology and the theology of religions have equipped me to apply a creative perspective that has been largely overlooked. In addition to the novel interdisciplinary overlap of sociocultural anthropology, theological anthropology, and the theology of religions, the diversity of the religious organizations and networks in the areas surrounding the town of Crestone, Colorado, has provided a fertile ground for theoretical speculation and methodological application. I have to make clear, however, at the very outset that the reason for traveling to Crestone this time around was not to do interreligious dialogue. Of course, if the opportunity for dialogue presented itself, and it did several times in the course of my research, I was delighted to seize upon it. My reason for a return visit was rather to attempt to test, as I said earlier, whether the ethnographic methods used by anthropologists of religion might enhance the process of interreligious dialogue. Once again, I did not go there to carry on interreligious dialogue, but I found Crestone a fit laboratory for the kind of research that attracted me there again after many years. My training and background, both anthropology and theology, provided me with the stimulus to critically examine how the contribution of anthropological, and more specifically ethnographic, methods to interreligious dialogue may increase the analytical sensitivity and insightful awareness of those who engage in the dialogue process. In one sense, some of the sections of the book that I'm writing could be construed as a sort of training manual for proponents of interreligious dialogue. My experience has taught me that the majority of those involved in the effort of interreligious dialogue are skilled theologians, most of whom, unfortunately, lack an acquaintance with important qualitative, social, scientific methods that could prove very helpful in refining their approach and expanding their awareness and observational skills. Okay, let's turn to the third topic here that I wanted to cover tonight, and that is now return to interreligious dialogue. Two key Vatican documents, Dialogue and Mission, and Dialogue and Proclamation, both of which were authored by the late Pope John Paul II, outline four major types of interreligious dialogue: the dialogue of life, the dialogue of action, the dialogue of religious experience, and the dialogue of theological exchange. Dialogue and Proclamation summarizes these four types of dialogue. It speaks first of, and I quote, the dialogue of life, where people strive to live in an openly and neighborly spirit, sharing their joys and sorrows, their human problems and preoccupations. End of quotation. Now, the other document, Dialogue and Mission, addresses this dialogue of life in greater detail. It says, and I quote, before all else, dialogue is a manner of acting, an attitude, a spirit which guides one's conduct. It implies concern, respect, and hospitality toward the other. It leaves room for the other's identity, modes of expression, and values. Dialogue is thus the norm and the necessary manner of every form of Christian mission, as well as every aspect of it, whether one speaks of simple presence and witness or direct proclamation. Any sense of mission not permeated by such a dialogical spirit would go against the demands of true humanity and against the teachings of the gospel. Dialogue and Proclamation then goes on to describe a second form of dialogue. I quote, the dialogue of action in which Christians and others collaborate for the integral development and liberation of people. End of quote. This brief definition is expounded even further in the other document, Dialogue and Mission, from which I quote. A further level of dialogue is that of deeds, action, and collaboration with others for the goals of a humanitarian, social, economic, and political nature, which are directed toward the liberation and advancement of mankind. This kind of dialogue often occurs today in the context of international organizations, where Christians and followers of other religions confront together the problems of the world. Dialogue and Proclamation continues, and when it describes the third form of dialogue, quote, the dialogue of religious experience, where persons rooted in their own religious traditions share their spiritual riches, for instance, with regard to prayer and contemplation, faith and ways of searching for God and the absolute, end of quotation. And again, I'll quote the longer description here from the other document, Dialogue and Mission. At a deeper level, persons rooted in their own religious traditions can share their experiences of prayer, contemplation, faith, and duty, as well as their expression and ways of searching for the absolute. This type of dialogue can be a mutual enrichment and fruitful cooperation for promoting and preserving the highest values and spiritual ideals. It leads naturally to each partner communicating to the other the reasons for his own faith. The sometimes profound differences between the faiths do not prevent this dialogue. Those differences rather must be referred back in humility and confidence to God, who is, quote, greater than our heart, 1 John 3:20. In this way also the Christian has the opportunity of offering to the other the possibility of experimenting in an existential way with the values of the gospel. And finally, we come to the dialogue of theological exchange, where specialists seek to deepen their understanding of their respective religious heritages and to appreciate each other's spiritual values. End of quote. And again, I quote the longer explanation here from the other document, Dialogue and Mission. A particular interest is the dialogue at the level of specialists, where, whether it be to confront, deepen, and enrich their respective religious heritages, or to apply something of their expertise to the problems which must be faced by humanity in the course of history. Such a dialogue normally occurs where one's partner already has his own vision of the world and adheres to a religion which inspires him to action. This is more easily accomplished in pluralistic societies where diverse traditions and ideologies coexist and sometimes come into contact. In the religious and spiritual organizations and networks adjacent to the town of Crestone, ritual is the main point of articulation with the public. Ritual is defined broadly here. It is an event of patterned human interaction marked by sacred, transcendent, and or aesthetic reference within a definite time frame and in a specific location. This ritual interface with the public provides the incentive for pilgrim participants traveling to Crestone in the first place, and occasions the operation of what I've called the ritual economy. These may be rituals of liturgy within a given religious tradition, like Buddhist meditation practices, Sufi zikrs, or the Christian celebration of the Mass, or the Havan Kunds of the Hindu ashrams, the fire ceremonies. They could be retreats, they could be spiritual addresses, such as Dharma talks, musical performances, artists' receptions, and communal meals of various kinds. Now, the ritual setting is the preferred context in which to carry on interreligious dialogue. Here, the material, behavioral, personnel, and cognitive components are condensed and displayed in a unique way, communicating the identity and core beliefs of the group. As such, it provides a rich array of traditional topics and potential contexts for establishing the baseline requirements for successful dialogue encounter. Because interreligious dialogue is praxis, it too is usually carried out in a ritual setting. Thus, ritual becomes the linchpin connecting anthropological methods with efforts to engage in interreligious dialogue. Now let's get into a little bit more specific stuff here. Here is one ritual I was at. It's called a Havan Kund, or a Yagna ceremony. It is being carried out by the Haidakandi Universal Ashram. This isn't a New Age ritual at all. This is a pre-Vedic Indian or Hindu ritual that probably goes back maybe 3,000 to 4,000 BCE. It's It consists primarily of offerings that are tossed into a fire pit, the Yagnashala, while there are mantras being recited of the various Hindu deities. You see the gentleman standing in the back. He's reciting the names of these Hindu deities. The gentleman whose picture or whose photograph you see at the other end of the Yagnashala there is Sri Babaji, who is was the teacher of this particular ashram, and you can see that his presence there is even being shaded by an umbrella. People at various times then threw in various offerings of fruit, barley, rice into the Yagnashala, and this constituted the ritual. There's so much here that an anthropologist could really use to stimulate interreligious dialogue. You could talk about the religious, the materials that are being used, the spatial organization of the people, who are the participants, who are the leaders, what is are the components of the ritual, how does it proceed? I mean, all of these things can be used to stimulate interreligious dialogue if you had the opportunity to do that. And I think an anthropologist, by being able to kind of analytically look at these various things that are going on, has the opportunity to get into those topics and enter into interreligious dialogue. Here's another scene of the yagna there at the Haidakandi Universal Ashram. Here's another Hindu ashram. When you enter the complex, there's a large labyrinth that confronts you right away. And I was very much encouraged to walk the labyrinth. I was told that it has healing properties of body and mind. It took me about 20 minutes to do this because it's a very complicated labyrinth. But the idea is that it provides something to use for stimulating interreligious dialogue. If I had more time and were able to set up a kind of circumstance of dialogue with these groups, the fact that an anthropologist kind of sees these things in a slightly different way could really help to promote that. Here is a Dharma hall of one of the Zen temples, the Dragon Mountain Zen Center. The people, you can't see it here, but in the foreground there were these zafus, these little mats that we sat on, and the teacher then would sit on this central zafu. But you see a special kind of spatial orientation here, an altar, a shrine in the background. You see the wall hanging, the tanka of Avalokiteshvara, who is the bodhisattva of compassion. And it gives you all sorts of things to be able to talk about and investigate if you really wanted to carry on interreligious dialogue with this group. Here's an outside view of that. I simply wanted to show you some of the architecture. This is a very common form of architecture. It's called a straw bale construction. And it's very common in this region, but the buildings are really well designed architecturally, and they're very beautiful. Here's another, actually this isn't a religious or spiritual organization, but one of the networks down there was a group of people called the Crestone End of Life Project. And what they were trying to do is trying to create the option of an open air cremation for people who wanted to have this arranged at the end of their lives. They wanted to provide a very humanitarian and kind of a ritualized way for relatives to gather around the little outdoor cremation facility here. And some of the local groups of religious and spiritual practitioners here actually used this for their members when they passed on. Here's just to give you some idea of what kinds of things I'm confronted with there. This is the inside of a shrine room of a Tibetan Buddhist a retreat center. You have central Buddhist image there of Shakyamuni Buddha, and Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion on one side, and Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom on the other. Much of the thinking of this Buddhist tradition balances both wisdom and compassion. But there's so many different elements here that one could use to stimulate or enter into interreligious dialogue. There are the elements, there are the statues themselves, but the singing bowl you see here, the flowers and the arrangements, so many rich things to create a dialogue. Whoops. Here is a solar meditation chapel that was built according to the principles of sacred architecture, and it's the Sri Aurobindo Learning Center. You see images of Sri Aurobindo. Some of you may be acquainted with this Indian political figure, and also he was a philosopher, and his consort, the mother. And again, this is just a little shrine table here that's in the solar meditation chapel. Whoops. This is the inside of the solar meditation chapel where people sat for a meditation, and they had a weekly reading from one of Sri Aurobindo's classics, Savitri, in this particular space, and I participated in some of these readings when I was there. Okay. The late Jesuit theologian Jacques Dupuy, from whom I took a course in interreligious dialogue at the Abbey of San Anselmo in Rome, Italy, some years ago, said, "The affirmation of one's religious identity grows not in confrontation with other identities, but in encounter with them." In attempting to establish the foundations of what has been labeled the theology of pluralism, Dupuy was one of the mentors who helped to stimulate my thinking about how the confrontation and collision of anthropology and theology might enhance the process of interreligious dialogue. My sabbatical encounter with the unique variety of religious identities on the outskirts of Crestone, Colorado, has reinforced my belief that the Holy Spirit of Jesus Christ is active in and through these spiritual organizations in some mysterious way and has something important to reveal to us. What this revelation is, or how we come to a knowledge of it, has not been revealed to me. But I remain convinced that the qualitative methods of ethnography can aid us to discern the nuances and sustain the momentum of the practice of interreligious dialogue until the revealing of the mystery of our unity in Jesus Christ in the end times, when the kingdom of God will be fulfilled in our midst and will become all in all. As spiritual writer William Johnston has said, the vision of holiness in another religion can lead to a conversion within one's own. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Aaron.
Sure.
We'll take 5 minutes for some coffee, refreshments, and some cookies, and come back here and for Q&A, okay? Any questions? Any more comments, observations? Yes, Benedict. Could you use the mic, please?
Brother Aaron, I've always been curious to know what's the difference between anthropology and sociology.
Okay. Anthropology and sociology, they're both social and behavioral sciences. They had different, even though anthropologists and sociologists, I think, are interested in some of the same kind of problems, it has traditionally been kind of a matter of scale that has differentiated them. Sociology had its origins in an urban setting, and the intentions were there were really kind of a social outreach to the local people in an urban setting. Anthropologists were always much more interested in so-called primitive societies. They were interested in some of the same kinds of questions, but they were in very different contexts. So they tended to develop, different. Sociology developed a lot of methodologies for very large-scale kinds of research, where they do a lot of statistical analysis, questionnaires. Also, sociologists usually didn't have to worry about some of the language problems that anthropologists did. Many anthropologists who went into the field not only could not apply these statistical methodologies and stuff to the societies that they were in, but they couldn't even speak the language of the people. They had to learn the language. I mean, in some cases, these languages were not even recorded, and anthropologists had to kind of, double as linguists in order to learn the languages, because there was no other precedent for learning the languages. So now today, their interests are converging more and more, because the so-called primitive societies are starting to merge in a kind of global way with lots of larger societies, and so some of the methodologies are converging, but anthropologists are still interested in smaller scale projects, kind of like mine, rather than taking on the really large kind of data projects that a lot of sociologists. Does that help? Okay. Any other questions or comments? Or, yes?
I was wondering, in this Crestone environment that you had looked at and been present in, what mechanisms were there for dealing with disagreements or conflicts between the different groups?
Okay. Many of the groups that were there, and I found this to be kind of surprising. I thought there'd be a lot more horizontal interaction with many of these groups, and in many cases there was not. And I'm not quite sure why that is the case, although I'm thinking about that more and more. I didn't really record a lot of conflicts between the organizations that were there. There was only one incident that I remember, that one of the Buddhist stupas, someone had desecrated it with swastikas, and nobody found out who it really was. It happened overnight. But nobody suspected that it was someone in the immediate area. It was probably someone who came in from outside. But there wasn't any kind of political mechanism operative there for conflict resolution on a large scale, because, as I say, I really did not record a lot of antipathy between the groups.
Brother Aaron, could you comment? Do you know what happened with the evangelical Christian groups that were there back in the 1980s, when these communities were first coming in, and what's happened with that interaction over the last, say, 30 years?
Well, the San Luis Valley is still economically a very impoverished area. But for some reason, 30 years later, coming back to this area, I did not encounter nearly the number of born-again evangelical Christian groups there now than there were 30 years ago. I'm not sure if some of these folks simply moved out of the area. I know a lot of the people that I talked to 30 years ago there had passed on. They died. So that might have been part of it. But for some reason, there was not the kind of conflict there this time around that I experienced 30 years ago. And these evangelical groups had merged into actually smaller groups that were within this development. So rather than being in opposition to it as they were 30 years ago, some of them had formed small groups even within the Crestone community and were meeting regularly. So there wasn't the sense of opposition so much. They were living a little more in harmony with these groups than they did 30 years ago when they were much more in opposition to the groups. So that was one of the changes that I noted when I was there.
I found it interesting that you mentioned ritual as the place where you want to do serious study, because it's so inherently integrational.
Right.
If I'm understanding you right, so it's just so I walk out here and I've got the message, you're looking at you're taking very, very seriously what's going on spatially, how people are organized when they come together for the ritual, what the materials are, what the words are, etc. Those absolutely kind of basic. So I mean, if you did ethnographic research on our Eucharist or on our evening prayer, you would be looking at blow by blow account of what we actually do. Am I getting this right?
Well, we're right. Every ritual is made up of all sorts of components. There are material things. That's kind of the sacramental dimension of the ritual, are the objects. But then you have a procedure. There's a correct ritual procedure. There's there's a spatial orientation to it. There are people who are celebrants and people who are participants. Even in our Eucharists here at the church or at any church, a ritual, that is the celebration of the Mass or some other kind of congregational celebration, is also a point of articulation with the public. I mean, that's the way the public encounters the church, is through the liturgy, through the ritual, primarily. And so, the ritual becomes a really important touchstone for understanding so much of what goes on in a religious or spiritual community, because there are so many elements that are condensed in ritual. They're there, they're in your face, and you can count them, you can investigate them. And this is why ritual is so important. Part of my issue too is, as an ethnographer, I wasn't able to actually live at the centers. I mean, I lived at the Spiritual Life Institute in my hermitage, but I wasn't able to live in the ashram. I wasn't able to live with the Tibetan Buddhists. If I was able to stay there 24/7 internally within their community, that would have given me, I think, a much different view of how they operated. But that simply was not. I wasn't permitted to do that. So I had to come in as a participant, like a lot of other people. And, ritual was the primary point of articulation with the community. And so that's why that became a very important touch point for me to study or to concentrate on. Yeah.
You mentioned that many of the spiritual leaders who were strong in their faith knew what their center and practice was about. You said you thought they were missing some certain skills to be able to have interesting dialogue. What skills would it be that you think would help for folks to learn?
Well, the skills are essentially the methods that I was talking about that anthropologists use. I mean, people who are very skilled in theology probably are not, as a rule, generally aware of the vast array of social scientific methods that they could use to enhance their study. For example, a participant observation, being a participant in a ritual and also somehow standing back from it so that one observes things like the elements of the ritual, the procedure, all that sort of stuff. Life history documentation. If you sit down with someone and you try to document their life history, you learn a lot about in-depth, not only about the person, him or herself, but how the whole a tradition has changed all the time and how it's been embodied in a particular person. It's those kind of things. Or there's a whole science of what's called proxemics or kinesics, where people's distance from one another or how they're configured when they're in a social group with one another. It's likely that a lot of theologians are not really terribly aware of those disciplines. So by knowing that or having some insight into that, it really helps you to gain a much deeper perspective of what's really going on than you would get from just the kind of surface conversation that people are doing. It's those kinds of methods that are important.
I was intrigued with the analysis you were doing with the purpose or the goals of religious dialogue. And I'm wondering, in terms of your own personal reflection now, after thinking about this for a while, what do you think are realistic goals for religious dialogue in this day and age at this time?
Well, the goals of dialogue, they're pretty idealistic. Yeah, I would agree with you on that. But it's, I think what we're looking for is we're trying not to always find the commonalities that other people have in their own religious life and expression, because we don't want to simply, reduce all the diversity to some common denominators. I think it's important to celebrate the diversity that we find, between and among the religions. My feeling is that, the diversity of religious expression is somehow a reflection of the diversity of the person of God. I mean, when we think of a Trinitarian God, we think of, the variability, the richness in God that, in my way of thinking, might be reflected in the variety of religious expression that we find today in the world. So I think we're never really going to achieve a kind of a unity with interreligious dialogue, because I think religion is tied to so much else in a society with its history, with the ethnicity, with the traditions. You can't just extract religion as one element out of a society and kind of study it in isolation. So I think a realistic goal is to document the diversity, to celebrate the diversity, and then to try to reflect on that diversity in light of the Christian message of the gospel and see where it leads from there. I think that's the best we could really do at this point. But I hope in the eschaton and the end times that this will all become very clear why all these different religions exist. I think it's a wonderful diversity, but I often wonder, I ask myself, why did God allow all this diversity to emerge in the first place? Why, if everyone should be Christian, why aren't we all just Christian? I mean, why is there this diversity? And I think there is something there to investigate, both anthropologically and theologically, that we have to look forward to. So.
John.
Aaron, two questions that are somewhat related, in fact very much related. In your research and the anthropology of the whole Crestone community, have you looked at what has brought these groups there besides Hannah and Maurice and the Manitou Foundation? Like, for instance, the Buddhist communities, the Rinpoches came and, studied the whole topography, the geology. They talk about the dragon lines, et cetera, et cetera. I believe Shinje Shumakai had a similar kind of exploration into the area and said, this is the place. So that's the first question, and related to that, but going back hundreds of years, the Native Americans brought their young into what was called the Bloodless Valley, delineated by the 4 major peaks there. And that's where they imparted to them their religious tenets, I suppose you could say. So have you looked at that part of the history and the makeup of that area?
I have. In fact, one of the things that I was intrigued with when I went to Crestone is people would constantly refer to this as a very sacred area. And one of the things I'm exploring in one of the chapters of my book is, what is this sacredness? What does it mean to these people? Because for every person who would say this is a very sacred area, they'd all come up with a different kind of a definition for it. And I'm trying to put those definitions together. But you're absolutely right. There is something about this area that is, it goes back historically, even to the Native Americans. There were many groups that came there, but they never fought. There's no evidence of any kind of competition or bloodletting with the Native Americans. Even the Native Americans, like Mount Blanca, for example, which is a nearby mountain, is very sacred to several traditions of Native Americans. So you hear this over and over again, and even the Tibetans, as you say, that came there, found they used various kinds of divination techniques, similar, for example, to feng shui, for kind of aligning their centers in relationship to the mountains, in relationship to the topography. So there's a whole kind of sacred geography and history that kind of intersect in this area. And I'm trying to define what importance is that kind of sacred, definition and intersection for the fact that all this diversity is now there. I mean, what is it about this region that attracts the diversity, the religious and spiritual diversity? I'm not sure exactly what it is. I'm convinced that the climate is part of it, and I'm convinced that the natural aesthetic, the beauty of the place is part of the attraction, because there's a close connection, as you know, between aesthetics and spirituality. And I think that those elements are kind of involved. But it's true that some of these groups were invited by Hannah and Marie Strong to come there, but one of the other attractions is that after some of these groups came, other groups came that were not necessarily invited by the Strongs. And I think part of the attraction was were the groups that were already there, but also this other kind of a magnetism about the area, this kind of sacred spiritual quality to the area that I don't know how to define at this point, but if you're there, you kind of feel it. And I really can't pinpoint it any more than that, but there's something very special about this area, geographically. So it's a very special place.
Let's thank our speaker for a wonderful presentation.